Hello and welcome to another episode of the Actionable Truth podcast. I'm Michael Ginsburg. Today's episode is a direct follow-up on a previous episode that I've recorded with Nicola Charles about probably a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And it also touches on the same topic, which is digital ID. This topic is very important for everyone globally, but it is especially the case for us in Australia just because of the way the agenda is progressing very, very quickly here. Before we start, I just want to say, as usual, if you're listening to the audio version, you may miss some of the material that we're going to present here. And if that's the case, I encourage you to check the video recording, which will be made available on Rumble, Spotify, and the Substack. This is also the only place you will find the show notes with the material to everything that is discussed here. This episode is also going to be different in the sense that this is the first time I'm actually live streaming a podcast, and also actually two things that are different about it. So first time I'm live streaming on Substack, and also the first time I'm live streaming and the first time I'm live streaming on Substack, which is very, very exciting. Which basically means that you will be able to participate in the broadcast as it progresses. So you will be able to comment and ask questions in real time through the chat window on the link that you can see below, which I will display shortly. And also, if you're watching us on Substack, through the Substack app and the Substack website on desktop or on your computer. Now, if you use the chat window in the link that I will display shortly, I may be able to display your comment or question directly in the broadcast. So I will be able to actually show it. If you're using the chat on Substack, I will not be able to display your comment or question, but I will be monitoring what you're saying there and basically we'll be able to address that as we progress. Now, as far as Q&A, you can give your comments at any time, but as far as the questions, if you can keep them till the end, we will have a dedicated Q&A session as we progress, probably about the last 15-20 minutes of this broadcast. Now that we're done with all this admin stuff, let me introduce today's guest. So today I'm joined by Paul G Conlon, an Australian engineer and fellow techie, who has literally written the book, or at least one of them, on the digital ID agenda. I will let him explain shortly. Welcome, Paul.
G'day, Michael. How are you? Lovely to be joining you.
Lovely to have you. So I guess before we start, I just wanted to, obviously you've written a book about digital ID, which is very, very valuable, and one of the reasons that I wanted to discuss this topic with you. But I guess what I want to understand is what prompted you to write this book in the first place? And also, if you can tell us a little bit about the sort of research that you've undertaken in preparation for writing a book such as this. I mean, this is not an article, this is a full-length book. So I'll be very interested to know what kind of research you've done on the topic.
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to. Well, I'll start with the name. It's called Citizen One, The Case Against Digital Identity. I think that's a fairly clear title. It's forwarded by Malcolm Roberts, currently sitting Australian federal senator, who sees the importance of this topic. And to be quite blunt, it cost a lot of my soul to put that together. It was about 3 years of research. So why devote 3 years of someone's life, I suppose, to writing a book? Well, like many over the last few years, I suppose I saw the world change. And from my eye, being having a technology background, I saw it change in quite a fundamental way. And I'm sure we're going to get into what that means in terms of digital ID. But first, maybe a little bit about me. I've got a couple of degrees. I've got an honours degree in electronic engineering and an information technology degree as well, both from the Queensland Uni of Technology. And I've spent over 20 years working with digital systems in various domains. So, you know, everything from gaming and wagering to the military, to high precision machine control and mineral exploration of all things. And it's got quite a broad career in that regard. So I guess when I talk about I saw the world change, it rung bells for me in ways that related to that career. So in one of my past lives, I was an engineering officer in the Australian Army, and that was a position where I saw technology used to very much influence the human experience. I think that doesn't need any further definition. You know, technology is deployed in the armed forces to terminate lives. That's what it exists for. But on the other side of the spectrum, I've worked in the private sector with AI-based, in particular, safety systems that involve the high precision control of hydraulic equipment, particularly as construction equipment like bulldozers and excavators and these sorts of things. There's a lot of smarts and automation in these systems these days when big construction projects are being built. And so I've seen the types of systems that are used for preserving life. So this is the application of digital technology for the preservation of life. So they're quite extreme examples, those two. And so I have a bit of a grasp of how the human digital interface kind of plays out in the real world. And what I saw in the last few years is what I would call a fundamental restructure of our society, particularly in relation to the individual and the state. And so I have a particularly interesting family history, which we've talked about extensively on other interviews. We can go into that if you'd like, but it connected a lot of dots for me. And I thought I want to do some extensive research to try and bring a well-reasoned, everyday set of arguments against digital ID. I didn't see that available in the public space at all, apart from the general cries, we don't want to live like China. But you know, people don't really connect with that emotionally. They understand mentally that it's going on, but it's kind of like it's the it won't happen to me type scenario. And so I went to great length to research a lot of the on-the-ground type of experiences under both digital ID and in general identification systems that are centralized under government control. And we can get into all of this, but I found that there were often alarming similarities between these types of systems in terms of how they're implemented, and similarities in terms of how the lived experience is on the ground underneath them. So yeah, it's research that's very human-based. I didn't want to write a textbook. It's something that I hope people will find very relatable and connect the dots in their everyday life and hopefully rally some action around this very important topic.
Excellent. No, that's great. And I have read your book. I wouldn't say that I've read every single page. It's just too much happening. But I did read. I kind of skimmed through all the chapters, and I like the fact that how, like, you know, I mean, this is effectively a technological topic. Like, it is a technology system, and you've kind of given it a human face in the sense that you've given an historical perspective, and I really like that. We're not going to get into the historical perspective, even though it's very interesting, and I do encourage people to check that out. But you have discussed that in as you said, in previous interviews, and I'm keen to touch on other topics that you haven't discussed as much. But I do like the approach that you've taken there, and also I like the approach that you've suggested the potential alternative at the end, which is again something that I haven't seen, and we'll touch on that as well. I guess, again, another thing, and I've alluded to that in the announcement post, we're not going to cover the basics of digital ID. So I'm assuming that people are already familiar with the basics, and if not, I've got a lot of material on that, and I'll include links in the show notes as well. So we won't touch on the idea of why digital ID is bad, or how digital ID works, or how digital ID leads to a CBDC, and who knows what other stuff. So we'll assume that people know that. And I guess what I want to do with you is kind of touch on two very real life examples. So nothing theoretical about it. Very real life examples of one system that is an actual digital ID. It is a national digital ID. It is a digital ID that has been successfully mandated by a government, right? And has achieved incredible adoption rate. Okay, and this is something that I was not even aware of, and I think a lot of people are not aware of up until actually I heard you mention it and discuss that in your book. And it also, I guess, another thing that people may find interesting, like, you know, initially when you think of, like, you know, a government mandating some, like, you know, surveillance system, like a 1984 very dystopian surveillance system, immediately you would think of China or some other, like, dictatorships, North Korea, places like that. But it's actually not. So I'll let you explain what the system is, what it's called, and where it's been actually implemented and is live now.
Yeah, well, you're referring to Aadhaar there, which is India's centralized biometric digital ID system. And you're quite right, it's a distinct case from the Chinese one. I mean, we're talking about a modern nuclear armed democracy here, essentially. So it's a little closer to home. And as you said, kind of less commonly known about. So I did a bunch of research in my book for this. And, it was launched in, I think, 2009. Incredible adoption rate, as you said, about 99% of the population, which is about 1.3 billion people, just to remind everyone. And it stores extensive biometric information on all its citizens. So this is fingerprints, this is iris scans, photos of children as well, and it links them all to a centralized database. And this is one of the key kind of architectural characteristics of these types of systems that cause all sorts of problems for, people like us who are looking down the barrel of living under one of them. So what does that look like? Well, the purpose for introducing these systems, it's often justified in different ways, but it rhymes, right? But ultimately, digital ID is fundamentally about resource denial. You don't have a password on your laptop just for fun. It's, if you know the password, you can access that resource and use the computer. If you don't, then you can't. So, when you apply that to a society, you need this identification for everything from financial systems, access to banks and welfare, and in the Indian case, SIM cards, work, rations, the whole spectrum of the lived experience, everything that you need in modern life. The centralization of it is particularly nefarious because we can get into some of the architectural characteristics of this, but what you're doing with any centralized system is you're building in a central point of failure. Now, that failure could either be technical or it could be, how should we say, political. So what does that look like? Well, I'll get into some of the details around its introduction. But first of all, the justification. So it wasn't a grassroots movement. Aadhaar's introduction wasn't initiated by the people. So that they didn't campaign for it. They didn't vote people in for it. It was kind of passively accepted by a population busy with other things, and the initial public response was mixed. There was skepticism. There was a lack of awareness and education. And particularly in India, in the rural sections and the underdeveloped regions, where this sort of stuff is just far outside the kind of Overton window or the experience of everyday life. And many people weren't familiar with either the benefits or the risks. So therefore, there was very little public debate. And the policies, or the politics rather, around introducing this system politically in India is a little bit different to the Australian case. India does have a sort of two-party federal system, a lower and upper house of sorts, but there's a bit of an exception there. There's a category of legislation called money bills, which doesn't require the Senate's approval. So they can be passed just by the lower house. And controversially, Aadhaar was flagged as effectively a money bill. So all the Senate could kind of do, and it's not called a Senate, but for our terms, was provide recommendations effectively. So there were kind of constitutionally dubious mechanism through which it was introduced. So resistance-wise, look, there was actually significant resistance from the privacy advocate space and some politicians as well. They were particularly revealing the lack of safeguards and legislative protocols. There have been court cases, there've been challenges in the Supreme Court in India that have eventually resulted in some sort of restrictions. But again, the horse is bolted by this stage. And I think prevention is better than cure with these systems. So what does this look like on the ground?
Yeah, we'll see how that looks like on the ground. So that I actually have like something that I want to play for that. But I guess what I want to understand from you before we play that video is what was, I guess, the primary justification, right? That the government in India, right, that is technically democratically elected, right? What was their justification to introduce a system like that?
Yeah, so in the Indian case, and this is where you get very similar parallels, right? In the Indian case, it was very much sold as a system to combat fraud. So in Indian culture and society, fraud is, I guess, well recognized as part of the cost of business. It's much more prevalent than we're accustomed to here, and it's somewhat integrated into the culture. And in part of my research, I came across a particularly relevant quote from 1985 of all things. It was from the president at the time, the prime minister at the time, Rajiv Gandhi was his name. And the quote is, of every rupee spent by the government, only 15 paise, which is the denomination, reaches the intended recipient. So it's on that grounds, on the elimination of fraud and friction within the system, that Aadhaar was introduced. Now that sounds all warm and fluffy, and it's a variation of the types of justifications that we hear throughout history, digital or otherwise, when we come to these sorts of systems. It's usually some sort of call to bureaucratic efficiency or convenience on the consumer's side. So it was very much to combat fraud in the Indian case.
And what was, okay, so there was I guess the excuse that the government, that's what they used in their advertising campaign, and we'll see that shortly. But what was the response from the people? I mean, ultimately, this is not China, right? I mean, the people can voice their displeasure with this. So was there any demonstrations? Was there any pushback? I mean, eventually they managed to achieve very, very high adoption rate, as we'll see. So what happened on the people side?
Yeah, as I said before, it was mixed. So there was resistance, but it was limited. So it was limited to those regions that were kind of involved in this sort of stuff. And like in India is a different planet to Australia. You know, it's very populous. It's got quite a nomadic population. There are very rural areas that are quite divorced from technology. So just the level of propagation of information and awareness, coupled with the digital literacy or literacy and numeracy in general, means that there wasn't really, maybe the resistance was pocketed, let's put it that way. And part of that, again, comes down to the fragmentation of the country. It's like many countries in one. There are many administrative areas that each have their kind of sub-administration levels of government, and they implement policy differently. It's like living in different nations. And so in that context, it's difficult to mount, or more difficult to mount, a unified national resistance. And I don't think we suffer from that as acutely in Australia, because we're less nomadic. We're more homogenized as a nation. There are fewer states, there are fewer administrative bodies. So rallying the nation on some sort of issue like this is more feasible.
100%. But I guess what I'm trying still to understand, because I think there's important lessons to be learned from even though there's obviously significant cultural differences. Did they were there any demonstrations? Did the people sign petitions? Did anyone try to say, look, I don't think, other than obviously the privacy advocates, but like the people on the street, did they have any concerns? Did they think, hold on, this is probably not a good idea, or we want to know more about it before we agree to that? Or what exactly is about? Yeah.
I'm not sure the extent, or whether there were demonstrations or to the extent, but I do have an interesting little snippet that I heard directly from an Indian working in India currently, actually, in the tech space, which may give you an insight into the answer to that question. Now, this quote is relevant to now, since the system is in, not prior to the legislation passing. But he spoke of, this is a colleague of mine, he spoke of there being an unwritten level of criticism that's tolerated in regards to speaking out against Aadhaar. And he said to me, if I walk around in the street wearing an I hate Aadhaar t-shirt, I might not be walking around in the street freely, at least for much longer. So
wow.
Obviously, that's since the systems come in. I don't know to what extent that was at play prior, but bear in mind too, the ability to protest to some extent relies on the comfort you have in maintaining your resources and your upholding your way of life. And the caste system in India, the very hierarchical nature of it, means that there's a cultural perception that citizens are subservient to their government. It's a fairly recent democracy, 1950, I think, and India's has had its kings, and the cultural inertia there can be quite slow. So there would have been, I suspect, quite a large degree of, well, if that's what our masters are telling us to do, then that's what we'll do type thing. Again, I think that's quite, and we'll get into some of the differences later, but I think that's different to the Australian experience, where at least historically we've had an ingrained skepticism of government. So yeah, I don't have any numbers to share with you in terms of protests, but there are a few factors there, I think, that indicate that at least a national, somewhat coordinated protest effort either didn't happen to any significant extent or did happen and was insufficient to overcome those hurdles.
So there was mainly, I mean, even though both countries, I guess, if we compare and contrast Australia and India, obviously both are democracies, but there are significant cultural differences. So the pushback in India probably didn't come because of cultural differences. People in obviously lower castes, like, I mean, they feel that they have no voice at all. So they don't feel that they're even in a position to protest. Would that be kind of like an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's okay. It's always apples and oranges with these things, but you can certainly see some parallels. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's see how it actually looks like. So when, like, as I said, I've never heard of Aadhaar until you mentioned that in another interview. And once you mentioned it, I said, wow, I was very surprised that it is actually in India and not in places like China. And I've done a bit of research just to kind of understand how this thing looks on the ground. And to be perfectly honest, I was very, very surprised to find a very, very good video on this topic and the risks that it poses from the ABC. None other than the ABC, Australia's public broadcaster, right? I mean, doesn't get more legacy media than this. So I was quite shocked. And this video is not that like long ago. It's only from 2 years ago. But I was very, very surprised that they were actually highlighting the risks. Now, they're obviously a legacy media outlet, so they don't, like, they outline some risks, but they don't get outright conspiratorial, right? So they don't get into like, okay, well, it will lead to CBDCs, it will do this, it will do that, your money will be programmed. They don't do any of that. But as far as like, the privacy risks and how life actually looks post-Aadhaar implementation, this provides a very, very, very good overview that should really open people's eyes, especially in Australia, because we are in that, like, I mean, legislation and all of that has already been passed. So we are really on the final kind of leg to basically something very, very similar. So I'm going to play that now, and I'm going to play it in full. It's only 5 minutes or 5.5 minutes, and we'll come back and discuss that after that. So let's have a look. Okay.
Think about this for a second. If Australian authorities asked for your fingerprints and your iris scans to keep forever, would you give them up?
A revolutionary change that gave a digital identity to each and every person without any discrimination of caste, creed, class, or of being rich or poor.
This is the reality for most people living in India at the moment. And I know because I handed mine over when I lived there too.
This is none other than the world's largest digital identity revolution. Aadhaar. My Aadhaar. My identity.
And I'm not the only one. 99% of Indians.
Now, I want to stop for a second to highlight something that she just said. 99% adoption. I mean, I cannot emphasize that enough. 99. I mean, this is like, we'll discuss that later, but this is something that is very, very hard to dismantle, even if the people want to do, if 99% of people have adopted it. So this is just incredible to me.
Indians, according to the department that governs this biometric system, have signed up. That's a whopping 1.3 billion people. It means my most personal details went into this immense Aadhaar database. Now, the Indian government says it's to enable more people, especially the poor, to access government and financial services like food rations or bank accounts.
Whereas earlier, one needed a number of cards for different tasks. Today, all identity-related work can be done with Aadhaar.
But technology and privacy researchers say this allows surveillance at a scale that's not been seen before in a democracy.
It surprises me immensely how casually this project is being just spread across all kinds of domains, all manner of databases being made, everything being linked up using the UID number.
Usha Ramanathan is a lawyer and human rights activist who's been campaigning against Aadhaar.
It surprises me because it's only very recently that we had a newspaper recognizing that the breach of this kind of data is a national security threat. Many people can get at it and you won't even know.
Getting my Aadhaar card was pretty simple. I just went to one of the government centers, scanned each of my fingers, did an iris scan, and then went on my way. But I pretty much felt like I had to, because it wasn't really clear what the consequences would be if I didn't. Would I be able to use my bank account? Would I be able to use my phone? There was just a lot of uncertainty.
Apart from the public distribution system and scholarships and things, they also said that you can't get married, you can't get a caste certificate, you can't get a domicile certificate, and went on for a while. Then the court stepped in and said that you can't compel people, you can't deny people any service because they are not enrolled. But they went ahead nevertheless and kept saying that they will deny. And what is very interesting in this is how all the way to the bottom, from the top, the system absorbed it. And so anywhere you went, they would say, no, you have to give your UID number or else we can't give you your service. So it was a lot of bullying, scaring people, fear-mongering, coercion.
Part of the government's reason for bringing in the Aadhaar system has been to eliminate fraud, like people duplicating identities to collect double the services they're owed, or the issue of leakage, where entitlements are diverted by corrupt bureaucrats.
Now, the centre has issued a warning against sharing the photocopy of your Aadhaar cards. The information can be misused by organizations.
And while the government has said the biometric databases are foolproof, there's been evidence of fraud continuing. But they won't provide data on how much fraud or human error plagues the system. Prasanna S. is an advocate in India's Supreme Court. He advises petitioners in Aadhaar cases.
There have been no studies, or if there are studies, it is there have been no reports. And even if there are reports and they are not in the public domain, there is now no data about the Aadhaar system itself. Even as the state becomes more and more data hungry, where the citizens are now forced to give their part with their personal data for any purpose under the sun, you see that there is a movement towards the state becoming less and less transparent.
The question becomes, what is all this data, collected like a dragnet and cross-referenced with other data, going to ultimately be used for?
In Telangana, they started linking the UID number with the voter ID number. And in that process, they dropped a large number of people saying these are all, the voter IDs were dropped saying these are duplicates, these are fakes, these are ghosts. And it was very close to the elections. There wasn't enough time for people to go and get redress on that. And in Telangana, the kind of model that they are coming up with, it's become like a police state where you're walking on the street and they can just take a picture and then send it across to see whether you're on any suspicious database. So it's not the stuff of which freedom is made.
Now, I don't live in India anymore, so the government doesn't need to keep my personal data. But once you're in the system, there's no getting back out.
So the UID is one system which is a really, really remarkable system which says you can opt in. In fact, you're not opting in, you get in. And you cannot opt out. There is no opt-out mechanism.
Pretty wild. So this is pretty wild. This is not science fiction. This is not like hyperbole. This is not like, some imaginary scenario that we've come up with. This is real life. For 1.3 billion people, right? The largest democracy in the world. Actually, I think the largest country in the world, full stop, as far as like population size. So I mean, I think that, like, I cannot emphasize how significant this is. And I mean, this video blew my mind. It's from 2023, and it only had like 8,000 views. I mean, this should have 80 million views, 800 million views. I mean, I'm just still to this day, I'm shocked that the ABC has produced something like that is better than I think like anyone really can produce. It is profound. So yeah, keen to hear your thoughts on that, Paul.
I mean, where do you start, right? The first thing I noticed is look at all the happy, smiling faces. I tell you who isn't happy and smiling. That's Sitar from Kakala village in India's northwest. So like the hundreds of millions of people who have voluntarily tried to comply with the Aadhaar requirements. For some reason, Sitar's fingerprints and iris scans weren't recognized by the system, and there's no accountability. There's no skin in the game, because when the system fails the people, if you're a bureaucrat, that doesn't impact your life. So there's no real accountability. But for Sitar, that meant that she was denied work, and she was denied rations, and she's a mother. She's got children. And there's a news article, I actually referenced this in my book, where she ended up in an emaciated state because she literally couldn't feed herself and her family. Despite trying to do everything to comply with the system, for whatever reason, it wouldn't be accepted. And bear in mind too, often when you have problems in India with this system, if you can't sort it out yourself, there's very little interest in helping you, and it often requires a 300-mile journey, multiple 300-mile journeys to the next bureaucratic kind of office where you try again. So Sitar certainly wasn't smiling there, but I mean, yeah. I mean, credit to the ABC. Like as you mentioned, they must have skipped their meds that morning when they posted that one. But I'm
was
glad
literally
they did.
shocked.
One of the comments there was, something along the lines of the biometric database is foolproof. I mean, pack up your bags and go home right now. That's a clearly false statement. Anyone who's worked even in the periphery of technology understands that the only secure computer is one that's switched off. There are always compromises at play, and that's a blanket false statement. The use of biometrics in general, particularly fingerprints, and this has come up in Australia's history as well, I'm sure we'll get into. There's a negative connotation around that as well. So the use of fingerprint technology was originally developed for criminal investigations. And I remember a personal experience when visiting Japan in the recent, I think it was 2018 or something like that, fairly recently. And, when you get off the plane, everyone is fingerprinted at the airport before entry. And I actually felt quite invaded in a way, because I had this mental association with criminal investigations, and many of us do. So, they also made a statement along the lines of, and we've seen this in the Australian case as well. They contrast these centralized systems against the clearly arduous situation of having to have multiple cards for different tasks. That is a feature of a system. Centralizing these things is the bug. So yeah, there's a lot of sales stuff in there in some of those comments, but it's clearly a shiny brochure type video, right? Look at all the smiley, happy faces. But
The ads are always
so a few of my
that.
thoughts there.
Yeah, the ads are always like that, and we'll soon see some of the Australian ones. And there is a recurring theme there. So I guess the things that I took away from that is, first of all, the 99% adoption. That just blew my mind. I didn't even think that China will be able to get 99% adoption. 99% of the Indian population, I don't know if it's adult, I'm assuming it's the adult population, it's not kids, but 99% of the adult Indian population is on Aadhaar. So that is just mind-blowing. The second thing is the biometrics. Yes, absolutely. And they use two. They use both fingerprint and a retina scan, right? The fingerprint, I guess people are used to it now in the sense that, you mentioned Japan, but there's a lot of other countries where you have to provide a fingerprint scan as a condition of entry. US, I think Malaysia used to do that. Vietnam used to do that. Maybe still does. So people are kind of, even though it kind of has the icky feeling of you feel like you're a criminal, why you're being fingerprinted, but you're kind of used to it now because you've done it in other places in order to get into the country. but I mean a retina scan. And as the lady said, once you're on it, you're never getting off it. There is no undo button ever. Like once you're on that, you're on it. And I mean, think about it. It's a database that has your fingerprint and your retina scan as a digital representation. So someone gets that, even if you have 2-factor authentication, 3-factor authentication. I mean, I don't know how many factors. They have your fingerprint, right? And they have your retina scan, a digital representation. I guess from a cybersecurity perspective, it's just incredible. I mean, the implications for that is just like literally like, I mean, anyone who's like, on it should be like, waking up in horror every morning, like not be able to sleep at night. So this is very, very profound. So this is like, I guess the things that I took away from that. And I guess it's interesting how kind of similar things and similar approaches are tried also in Australia, obviously with the cultural differences that exist between the two countries. But it's kind of like, my Aadhaar, my ID, like those like short and catchy slogans. So let's have a look, right, at how it is done in Australia. And let's see if people can spot the 3-word slogan, right, before I will reveal it. So let's have a look. Okay, so let's see. All right. Okay. 1 second, guys. Some technical difficulties here. Oh, there we go. All right, sorry about that. Let's see. So first of all, this one doesn't have the 3-word slogan, but it has something else in it. So I'll mention that as we go along.
MyGovID is now simply MyID, the new name for one way you can identify yourself for government services, and in the future, other places too.
And in the future, other places too. Okay?
And you don't have to change a thing.
How nice of the Australian government. All right. Now let's get into the 3-word slogan.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Digital ID isn't just about security. It's also about convenience. With Digital ID, logging into services is quicker, simpler, and more secure. A cutback on usernames, passwords, or delays in processing applications. For example, when requesting a tax file number, the process can take as little as just 10 minutes instead of 28 days. Or you could use your Digital ID to complete a digital statutory declaration online without needing to have it witnessed. Once set up, you won't need to upload or send copies of your driver's license, passport, or other IDs. You can verify your identity quickly and securely, all from your device. Even if your physical documents are lost or damaged, your Digital ID stays with you, allowing verification anywhere, anytime, whether at home, while traveling, or after hours when offices are closed. This flexibility gives you greater convenience and access to services no matter where you are. Digital ID, secure, convenient, and voluntary.
What is the Digital ID trust mark? It's important to know that your Digital ID provider is trustworthy. That's where the Digital ID trust mark comes in. The trust mark is a stamp of approval for providers who meet rigorous standards for privacy, cybersecurity, fraud control, and more. It provides transparency by showing which services come with the safeguards we all expect. Digital ID providers displaying the trust mark have gone through a strict accreditation process, so you know they're legitimate and safe to use. You can also find a list of accredited providers on the Digital ID Accredited Entities Register, which is regularly updated for added peace of mind. When you see the trust mark, you can be confident that your personal information is being handled securely and responsibly. Look for the Digital ID trust mark for assurance that your data is in safe hands. Digital ID, secure, convenient, and voluntary.
Who can use Digital ID? And do you have to have one? Digital ID is available for people aged 15 or over who want to keep their information secure. You don't need to be an Australian citizen to have one. Digital ID is also available to people who have a visa. And it's voluntary for individuals. You choose whether or not to create or use one, and you can deactivate it at any time. And don't worry, if you can't or don't want to use Digital ID, you won't be left behind. Government services for individuals that are part of the Australian Government Digital ID system will continue to offer other ways to verify your ID, to access those services. A secure Digital ID is just another option for proving who you are online. Digital ID, secure, convenient, and voluntary.
All right, let's see who can spot the 3-word slogan. Anyone wants to have a go and put it in any of the chats before, obviously, I'll reveal it. It should be pretty obvious. Let's see if we have any takers. All right, doesn't look like anyone wants to have a go. I'll give it a couple more seconds. No takers. Okay, so obviously the 3-word slogan is secure, convenient, and voluntary. Right? We have a recurring theme here, and especially that last word of voluntary. Okay, I think we have heard that one before somewhere. Okay, so let's play a little video just on that topic of voluntary. So again, in the Australian context, that should give people, I guess, a very, very good idea. All right.
Digital ID system being safe and trustworthy and voluntary. Government's position on COVID-19 vaccinations is that it is voluntary.
COVID vaccine is now mandatory.
All authorised workers in Victoria must be fully vaccinated
or risk losing their
That
job.
will be implemented in a partnership between the Commonwealth and the states.
It's not a choice to get vaccinated.
Decisions that state governments and the Commonwealth government took were difficult.
The Queensland Supreme Court has found mandatory COVID vaccination for police officers and nurses unlawful.
And they balanced up, as is always the case with human rights.
Outgoing Commissioner Katarina Carroll failed to give proper consideration to human rights.
And in breach of their human rights.
It is voluntary, and obviously people will make that decision for themselves.
If you're an individual, you will not have to have one of these digital IDs.
It is voluntary.
Okay, so that's, I guess that's as far as the voluntary part, right? So I don't think I need to add anything about that. But Paul, let's talk about, first of all, the secure and the convenient. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm trying very hard not to go on quite a lengthy rant here with those ones. Yeah, just on the voluntary quickly, people want to dig a little bit more into the subjective nature of that word, very much in line with that excellent Milk Bar video there. They can jump on my website, and I've written an extensive blog on what that actually means in reality, and how it's a simple word that hides all manner of sins. But yeah, secure and convenient. Okay, so convenience. So I note that the shiny sales pitch there was able to provide at least one concrete example, applying for a tax file number. So you can do that now supposedly in 10 minutes rather than 28 days. You tell me, Michael, here's a question. When's the last time you applied for a tax file number? You know, does that really impede your working week every week? Like I don't know how frequent, frequently people are applying for tax file numbers.
Yeah, people do it once in their lifetime.
So we shave, 28 days off, waiting time off getting a one-time event, and presumably that's one of the more convenient uses of this system, given it's the one they picked, for the video there. The stat deck, the signing a stat deck. So that was another one they mentioned. Again, question to you or to anyone, when's the last time you had to sign a stat deck? I mean, it doesn't really hinder my every working day. I can't see how it at all justifies onboarding the incredible risks that these safety critical systems necessarily impose on people. So the security stuff, well, I'm sorry, but from my point of view, there's a fairly simple test here when it comes to security. You can't talk about the level of security on anything unless you've got some skin in the game when it goes wrong. You know, if you're selling the virtues of the features of a fireproof safe or something, it's wonderful safe, you know, it's completely secure. Unless you've got your own gold or cash or valuables or, you know, family photos stored in there and you're willing to put that on the line, there's actually some personal loss involved at your end. You know, if things go wrong, then I just don't see that you're credentialed to make any sort of statements about security. You know, and again, going back to Aadhaar there, that's very much the case. You know, the bureaucrats that hold all of these people's information at their fingertips, there's no negative outcomes for them when they're leaked, and we didn't talk about some of the sizable leaks that have already happened from Aadhaar. But so as far as I'm concerned, it's a dead argument because there's the no skin in the game factor, and a lot of these. How do you define security? So here's another general comment about this suite of videos here. You can't reduce the complexity of a national identification system down to a simple video, like such a simple snippet like that. Anyone attempting to do so is, I don't know, maybe disingenuous might be a little bit strong, but it gives me a sense of where there's smoke, there's fire. You know, why does it need to be such a shiny kind of simple thing? Are we children as a nation? Are we children? Can we not have a more nuanced debate than those videos you just described there? Because I tell you what, the systems that they're advocating for on the back of these simple videos don't at all reflect the video's simplicity. They're very complex, and the implications they have on the lived experience of everyone is potentially dire. So there seems to be a real disconnect there. Trust was another one. That's part of security. So trust is one of those words that sounds warm and fuzzy, and you know, when you hear it, it elicits these thoughts in your head of, you know, how you trust a family member or a long-term friend or something. But that's not the type of trust that we're talking about here. I devote a whole chapter actually to trust in my book, because it's a very nuanced topic, and I think there's a degree of conflation in that terms, you know, in that term where we see videos like that where they use the word trust, they're evoking that warm sense of relational trust that we're accustomed to in our everyday life with what is effectively an institutional relationship. That is not trust. Trust is earned, and I just don't see the credentials that the government has earns that trust at all. We heard reference to, you know, these systems having the safeguards that we all expect, or words to that effect. Please define that. What safeguards do we all expect? What's everyone's general level of digital literacy? You know, I don't know how you define that. So same comment goes with the supposedly strict accreditation criteria. Well, here's a general kind of outcome or takeaway from the research I did from my book. One of the core kind of features or components of these centralized systems, digital or otherwise, is something like in the Australia Card terminology, which we'll get into, that was called the companion entity system. But effectively, there's a component to the legislation or the system that necessarily deputizes the private business. So the areas where this actually needs to be enforced on the ground. In the Aadhaar case, part of the source of leaks is the fact that the underlying identity information in the system is actually shared with third parties, and they make determinations based on the underlying identity data. So that's an extremely risky scenario, because once you've released that data to third parties, you don't control their level of privacy and security. You've completely, the horse is bolted. You have no influence over that, and a chain's only as strong as its weakest link. As soon as it's out there in this companion entity system, you have no no ability to make these claims of security at all. And there are variations of this kind of sharing identity data with the deputized entities or businesses or corporate entities that need to implement the policies. So it's out of the control of the centralized organization anyway. But again, that doesn't matter unless there's skin in the game. That's my best attempt at avoiding a rant. I'm not sure how successful I was at it.
Now that's good. That's really valuable. I mean, I guess from my perspective, so let's talk about secure and convenient. Okay, let's start from the convenient aspect first, because that's easier for people to understand, because we actually have a real life example that is available right now. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so that's the WA, so the Western Australian state government. So that's one of the Australian states, right? The biggest state by size, by territory, right? So they have something called the Student Assistance Payment. Okay, now that's the page. I'll include the link in the show notes, but have a look at this. So it doesn't really matter. We won't go about the eligibility, but have a look. How to claim. Submit your claim through Service WA. Here are the QR codes to download the app, right? Get free, and look at that. For support and general information about Service WA, including assistance to download the app and set up My ID. Remember My ID and other places too? Here's one place. So they'll help you, no problem. Call customer support, they'll set up the My ID for you, and they'll take your biometrics and you just download the app. So that's your convenient. Very, very convenient, right? And they say, they even have in-person help. They have kiosks. They have whatever you want, right? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Look at that, right? Whatever you want, we will just do it, right? But you need to scroll all the way to the bottom to find alternative claim methods, right? And they tell you, they say, look, yeah, there's other ways, but you don't want to use it, because the Service WA app is the fastest and most convenient, secure, convenient, voluntary to claim the WA student assistance payment. This is a real government webpage. I'm not making this up, right? So if you don't want to use that and you're going to walk the slow way, look, you can claim online or you can do a claim form, right? But they say it's going to take longer. Claims made through this method may take longer to process. So if you want the money fast, right, because whatever, you need the money to buy supplies, school supplies for your kid, right? You need that $250 now, quickly, right? Or $150, right? Better for you to set up My ID, and look, we have all this support for you. 20 hours a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whatever you want, just do it, right? So that's the convenient aspect. Right. As far as the secure aspect, right? So it's interesting that and I'll play a video shortly, but the government is taking the line that, look, if instead of this being decentralized, if we control all of that and everything is done through us, then everything is good. Right? Everything will be fine. You don't have you don't have to worry about it. It'll be a lot more secure. Now, this is, again, not the first time that they've used this argument. So people in Australia will be familiar with that, but people overseas may not. So a few years ago, we had the electronic health records, right? Where basically it's called My Health, literally same name, right? It's called My Health, where all the health records were digitized, right? And it was opt-in, it wasn't mandated, but basically all your, if you go to different doctors, they can access your health records and see all the conditions you've had, what medication, if you had surgery, all that sort of stuff. You don't have to repeat that. And again, it was promoted as very, very convenient, because if you go to a new doctor because you moved cities or whatever, they'll already have all your medical history. They don't need to get it from the clinic. So again, it's convenient because it's faster, and it was voluntary, but a lot of people signed up. And I think literally within a month, it was hacked and the information was uploaded to the dark web, literally within a month, right? Because everything was centralized. And from a cybersecurity perspective, And I mean, from any perspective, think about it as a common thief, as a petty thief who's trying to like steal a pot of gold, right? If you know that there is a pot of gold distributed between 30 places and each place has a small quantity, or you can go to like, you know, the central bank and somehow blow the vault and steal everything, all the gold is there. What's better for you? Like, you know, what gives you like more benefit? So this is like an oxymoron. It makes no sense on any level, on the most logical sense, like, you know, the most logical aspect of it. So I want to play actually something that you sent me, Paul, I believe, and that's let's see if we can play this one. Let's see.
Just
All
while
right.
you're doing that, if it's all right, just a couple of follow-up comments.
Sure.
Yeah, what you're describing there is a category to look out for. Nothing in life is free. And when you get these little goodies dangled in front of you, one needs to ask the question, what's the cost? Now, we saw that in Aadhaar as well. So the national government extensively leveraged its control over the welfare system. And that's one of the reasons we saw such a high adoption rate. We need to qualify these terms. So we're not talking about voluntary adoption here. It's just adoption. Now that makes it sound like everyone's happy to use it, but yeah, they're leveraging these welfare systems and dangling goodies. So what other sort of goodies? Well, many people in India were given free or heavily subsidized SIM cards. There was network infrastructure put in to capture more of the rural areas. This all sounds wonderful, right? But nothing in life is for free. What is the cost? So beware of the goodies. Another takeaway point from what you were saying there is we all need to ask ourselves a very important question. What is your sovereignty worth to you? Put a dollar figure on it. Because that claim case in the WA government site there referenced a $250 claim. So is $250 the cost of your sovereignty? Not just your sovereignty, but your family's sovereignty. So going back to one of the previous videos you shared there, there was a comment along the lines of, you know, if your identification cards are lost or stolen, don't worry, your digital ID stays with you, even beyond your death. So we cannot appreciate what it's like living today with such high resolution, immediately available data that is effectively timeless. And again, I devote a lot of time in layman's terms in my book to describe some of the qualities of digital data. It doesn't go away and fade like our natural bodies do. So ours will be the first generation where our lives are captured in crystal clear, high resolution databases that will persist beyond our deaths. So that's a bit akin to the shadow outlasting the object that casts it. You know, what relevance is identifying data if you're no longer alive? I'll tell you what the relevance is. It can have a direct impact on our children and our grandchildren. We see that socially now. There are calls for people alive today to, you know, pay for the supposed sins of those who have come before them. Well, what if those supposed sins are in high resolution data from hundreds of years ago? I mean, we can't appreciate yet what the social impacts will be. So I don't know. My cost for sovereignty is non-negotiable. And I find it, again, a feature that my identifying information and all the cards and so forth that go with that do degrade with time, as my body does. They do get lost. That's a feature of the system. So yeah, again, a couple of thoughts there. On the security side, it might be worthwhile putting some numbers to this, because you can arm wave about hacks and so forth, but let's look at what's actually happened with Aadhaar. So in 2023, so this is fairly recent, I think there was one of the largest breaches of Aadhaar. 815 million Indians' personal data was leaked. So that's all sorts of personal details, the Aadhaar number, obviously the names, phone numbers. I mean, we've seen already the sorts of information this system holds. Again, no accountability for the bureaucrats. It actually took a US security firm to detect the leak. And that follows up from the trifecta in years before, in 2019, 2020, and 2021. So 3 consecutive years, there were 300 million 20 million and 100 million users were exposed. So, it's just a baked-in characteristic of the system. As I've said before, the only secure computers is the one that's switched off. Look at the order of magnitude of breaches that's happening in India in just current years. So again, I think the whole secure thing can just be shown the door. It's a non-argument.
100%. And I mean, you said the only secure computer is a computer that turned off. I mean, yes, that's the ultimate security. But I mean, even if you go one level less extreme than that, I would say it has to be air-gapped, right? Anything that is connected to the internet by definition is not secure. And that is, I mean, as someone who comes from a cybersecurity background, that is the one thing that nobody in the cybersecurity industry will tell you, because they want to sell you products and services, right? Just like the pharma company wants to sell you vaccines and who knows what else. There is no way to guarantee security for any system that is connected to the internet, because, and as I kind of hammered that many times before, the internet is not designed to be secure. It was never designed to be secure. It was designed to be resilient. You cannot have security and resiliency. You just can't. You have to compromise on something. So that's where my take is on that. And as far as centralized and make it all convenient, I want to play this video. So this is a video that you sent me, and it's actually really, really good one. So that for people who are not Australian, they may not recognize this guy. So his name is Bill Shorten. And he used to be leader of the opposition. Then he became government services minister. I think now he's in some university, so he's left politics to greener pastures. But look what he says, and look how he justifies things. Let's have a listen.
Contact with government for human services. That's a fundamental part of daily life.
No, hold on. Let me play that again.
Today, I unveil a project that we have in development that we call the Trust Exchange, or TEX. All that's been exchanged is a digital thumbs up from the government that you are who you say you are. And given the importance of digital technologies in improving people's lives, it's important that the Australian government helps to build trust. More and more we do our banking and shopping online. We order our food, we ride share, we pay for parking, we book appointments, we do our tax online. And we'd prefer to organise our government services online. Not everyone needs their own app. Not everyone needs their own processes. One door is better than many doors. We need other departments and agencies to come on board so we can offer the Tell Us Once experience across key events in people's life journeys. For a lot of Australians, their contact with politics is fleeting. But their contact with government for human services, that's a fundamental part of daily life.
Okay. So it's interesting, basically trust us and you don't have to worry about it. Now, another angle that I think, it's worth mentioning here, from the business perspective, if people think that maybe we can pressure businesses and as a result, they will kind of save us and not participate. I can tell you, think from the perspective of a bank, right? Or a brokerage company or anything related to an industry that has regulatory requirements around KYC, know your customer, right? So at the moment, right? A bank needs to, in Australia, they need to collect what's called they need to do what's called a 100-point ID check. So basically, they need to collect a bunch of documents that together, they basically, every document has a value, and together it brings you to 100 points, okay? So they need to do more work, right? Then they need to store this information to prove that they've done that. Right, so they need to store that potentially indefinitely. So they need to make sure it doesn't get hacked in order to comply with privacy legislation and security legislation and stuff like that. Here, the government comes and says, "Look, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, Mr. CEO of Bank X. Don't worry about it. We're gonna do that for you, and we're gonna tell you, we're gonna give you a thumbs up from the government, right? That this person is who they say they are." Right. So from the perspective of the CEO of the bank or the chief technology officer of the chief information security officer, they just save themselves an enormous amount of work, expenses, compliance, staff. Right. They will be literally competing, jumping over each other, who can adopt that quicker. So from their perspective, this is brilliant. They're gonna love that. So, if you think that you're going to, pressure a bank not to do that, right? As long as other banks are doing that, they are at a disadvantage. So the pressure has to be on all of them at the same time. right? That's the way I see it. And I guess that's a good kind of segue to discuss, like, how we can counter, like, this propaganda. Like those are actual ads that I just showed from the Australian government are running now, and they clearly have, like, the 3-word slogan sorted out. So they're good to go. They're running, like, they are off to the races. So before we figure out, like you and I, Paul, how we potentially can counteract that, I want to also highlight the example that you mentioned of the Australia card, right? That was successfully defeated, right? So that's a good example in the sense that it was stopped. It was a national ID scheme that was stopped, right? It wasn't a digital ID, but it was actually stopped. And it'll be interesting to discuss, like, how it was stopped and what potentially lessons we can learn from that. But I guess for the benefit of people, because we're talking about the 80s, right? So there may be people who are, like, not aware of that, even if they are Australians, and I mean, I wasn't aware of that, and definitely for people overseas. Let me see if I can play that another little clip that you sent me. So that's Channel 7 News, like the opening few seconds. Channel 7 News, 1986. All right, so let's have a look at that.
Evening, Mark Gillies with the latest from the 7 newsroom. It's been revealed that the legislation for the proposed national ID system carries with it penalties of up to $20,000.
The opposition and the Australian Democrats say they'll block the legislation in the Senate after it was discovered the Australia card penalties include the fines and jail terms of up to 5 years. In other news, more controversy over uranium exploration in Kakadu National Park. Mining giant Pico Wallsend plans to resume its explorations, but the government says it will do everything it can to stop any mining. Those stories in News World.
After the movie. All right. I wonder what movie they shot after that. So that's interesting. So this was an initiative that the government has pushed very, very hard, but it was actually defeated, right? So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Paul. Like, first of all, how was it defeated? And whether there are any potentially lessons that can be learned for our situation right now, which is pretty dire. I would say a lot more dire than what it was in the 80s.
Yeah, sure, Michael. It's a big topic, and as you said, it was the 80s, so it's fairly recent Australian history, but still there are plenty of people who won't be aware of it. Now, the Australia card is just part of our history here that gives me a spring in my step. It, to me, just encapsulates in one national example of citizen resistance what's possible. And it also shows us a little bit about the bones that this country is built on. And I agree, we're in a dire situation, but by no means is all lost, and by no means should we not try. So just to riff a little bit about the Australia card, what was it? It started actually quite innocuously. So in 1985, the government released federal government released a white paper on tax reform, actually, in the lead up to a tax reform summit that was being held that year. And it briefly mentioned the introduction of a national identification scheme. So what did that look like? Well, over the years, it spanned a few years, this campaign, not many people really paid much attention to it. Its characteristics share the characteristics, as I've mentioned before, of many of these other analog and digital identification systems. It was effectively proposing that every citizen hold a physical card in the 80s. Now, at the time, people were loosely aware of the computing technology that was possible at the time. Credit cards were starting to come in. They were kind of skeptical of that. They were aware of the sort of fraud around it. And so what the government was proposing, again, under the auspices of an eclectic range of benefits, from eliminating welfare and immigration fraud, illegal immigration, to, the convenience of better access to government services, all the same talking sheet, right? So they were proposing storing centrally everyone's names, their nicknames, their travel plans, their genealogical data, their passport details. If you hold multiple passports, they wanted access to those too. They wanted your employment records, your citizenship status, your eligibility for Medicare, which was actually introduced the year prior in 1984. They wanted a 2-year residential history for everyone, and a digitized image of everyone's signature. And again, all the shallow justifications were used. In 1986, the government proposed a submission to a Joint Select Committee. It was a 300-page submission titled "Towards Equity and Fairness." So there's 4 words, pretty close to our target. So everyone was to have a unique code issued by a governing body. In that case, it was the Health Insurance Commission, the HIC, and that was going to be used by many. What it required was it imposed obligations in 2 significant areas. So obligations on individuals to start with. So they had to produce the card, or the proposal was that they had to produce the card in all manner of daily exchanges for which there was no current hurdle. So these were introducing new identification checkpoints scattered throughout society where none existed at the moment. And again, I've read the entire bill from the 80s. It's all still available in the typewritten PDFs and the Joint Select Committee's report, dissenting report. And the level of granularity of access to society was alarming, especially for the day. So you couldn't be employed, you couldn't travel, you couldn't pay anyone, you couldn't even hold a safety deposit box without an Australia card. So I think people got the idea that this was very invasive. Another characteristic is the weaponization of language against those opposed to the introduction of the identification system. Now, I mentioned before in Aadhaar the case of walking around with an "I hate Aadhaar" sign. The labels used against opponents in the 80s for the Australia card, the opponents were called friends of tax cheats. Whatever that means. So it lay dormant-ish for a number of years, but was ultimately blocked twice by an effective political opposition. Now, this is one of the distinctions between the Indian case that I mentioned before and Australia's case. We have a more established rule of law and effective governance at federal, at state levels, and in the 80s at least, the Senate was used in the way that it should, and quite legitimately spoke out about the concerns that were being expressed by the public, and it was blocked twice in the Senate. And under our constitution here, that means that both the lower and upper house can be spilled into a general election. Interestingly, this was proposed under the ALP, a Labor government here. Interestingly, during that double dissolution campaign, the card hardly came up. In fact, the bulk of the public awareness was still absent during the election campaign that was only triggered because of this actual issue, which I found really interesting. And the ALP won the election. Prime Minister Bob Hawke at the time was re-elected. Now, after that election, he said that the introduction of the Australia card was the government's top priority, and boy, did that set a fire under Aussies, because I think that was 1987 that happened. Now, I'll relinquish the mic in a moment, but what happened thereafter was, quite spirited, and I think shows us a little bit of a way possibly forward now. So I'll let you comment on that first.
Yeah, sure. No, that's actually great, because like I literally have no background on that. So that to me, that seems basically what you're saying is there was political opposition, but was also very, very significant pushback from the people to the extent that it became a major election issue. Would that be accurate?
No, actually. So the opposition was post-election. So this is really interesting. It was when the government was re-elected and said, we're now setting as our top priority this Australia card, that the opposition really started ramping up. So again, like, it's not over until the fat lady sings. One of the things I try to do in my discussions here is leave little breadcrumbs of hope and optimism. It's not all about the doom. And I just find that quirk about it being post-election, because as you mentioned before, we're now post-legislation with digital ID. Don't think that that's the end of it, because, again, it was only 4 decades ago or whatever, that almost exactly since the announcement. It's only after that election that society arose. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, look, I think also obviously there was there was one, from my perspective, there's one major difference with the Australia card compared to the situation right now is the fact that the Australia card was, obviously we're talking about the 80s, it was a physical thing that you had to carry with you. So people can know, oh, like shit, if this thing goes through, I'll just have to carry another thing with me in addition to whatever, my driver's license. Right, so it's physical. People can understand that you don't have to be like a geek or some like technology whiz to understand what this means, right? Just like with things like vaccines, right? I mean, you don't need to be a doctor to understand that there's some person now with a syringe that's going to put it in your arm, right? So you don't need to be an expert on that in order to understand what is actually happening. With digital ID, I think, as someone who also comes from like a technology consulting background, people who don't work in that space, like you do, like what I used to do, they don't envision what it actually means. So what does that mean? So I have to download another app to my phone? Okay, cool. I mean, no dramas, What does it actually mean? So I think that's probably why we don't have as much pushback. The other thing is, obviously, you said that back in the 80s we had an effective opposition in Australia. We definitely don't have that now. I think the elections have proven that beyond any reasonable doubt. And not only that, I mean, with things like, the under 16 social media ban, I mean, both sides were 100% fully on board. And both sides were fully on board with the fact that, one of the ways that will be used to verify age, like for people, and everyone's age will need to be verified, because how do I know that you're over 16, right? Or that you're under 16? I need to test everyone, right? Will be through a digital ID. So I think from our perspective, and that's kind of what I've been hammering now for quite a while now, this needs to be made very, very clear to people, right? What it actually means in real terms, because it is very, very amorphic. And the problem that we have is that, unfortunately, in Australia specifically, but I think the situation is getting pretty dire in the US as well with Real ID, we are running out of time. We don't have time to basically teach people, right, how that will impact their life. But we need to make it very, very obvious for them how life post-implementation will look like. And that's why I think, from my perspective, that ABC video is mind-blowing. Like, you basically, take that and you say, look, Australia, look, America, look, EU, if you let this happen, this will be your life. And this is not us exaggerating, extrapolating, conspiracy theories. This is live. This is real life for Indians. 99% adoption. So I guess for me, I mean, I always and I'm by nature, I'm like that. I always advocate for the softly approach. I do believe in education, I don't like hammering people. And there's a lot of fear and negativity that is already out there right now. So I don't kind of want to contribute to that. But the problem is that we've tried other approaches, and in Australia specifically, but a lot of other countries as well, but definitely in Australia, we have not, it just didn't click with people. People still don't understand what is happening. And the concern that I have is that we are running out of time. So if we try and keep educating people, I mean, this is not even a political matter anymore, because the legislation is passed. It is law, right? So it's not even, in that sense, we are already one step further than the Australia card. So the Australia card, we managed, or the people, or the political system managed to prevent that before it went through the parliament. This has gone to, everything is through parliament. This is all legislated fully in Australia. And in the US, for example, I mean, Real ID has been legislated for decades. I mean, after 9/11, I think that legislation has been put in. So the only thing that can stop us, the way I see it, is if there is no adoption. Right? So people are, no matter what happens, no matter what advertising campaigns, no matter what stick, no matter what carrot, no matter what anything, people just don't sign up for My ID. And the reason why I know that this will work definitely 100%, because it has already worked. We know that it could have worked in the past. So if we look back just only a few years ago to the vaccine mandate, right? If the vaccine take up in Australia, initially, it was pretty low. People were not rushing to get vaccinated, maybe except Victoria. right? But when it started to be mandated, and you couldn't go to the pub, you couldn't go to the movies, you couldn't work in certain jobs, right? You couldn't enter stores. I think in WA it was crazy, like they couldn't even go into a bottle shop, right? So that's when people kind of under duress got vaccinated. But if people understand, if people knew at the time that if they do that, they will suffer severe, health consequences and potentially death, right? Potentially death. Literally, they need to understand, if I take that, there is a good chance that I will actually die, right? If that was already in their psyche, once the mandates started being pushed, that would have reduced the uptake of the vaccine significantly. And if the uptake remains is low and remains low, no matter what the government tries to do, the mandates would have collapsed. Because if only 30%, even if only 50% took the vaccine, what are you going to do? You're going to lock out half of society? So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it might be helpful to look a little bit at what that resistance campaign comprised of, because there are a few tiers to it. And as you mentioned, the political landscape here is demonstrably different. So maybe we can not write it off. I make a case for still remaining politically active. We need to support candidates willing to repeal this legislation. Legislation can be repealed. But yeah, let's brush that one aside for now. But I'm happy to run through a little bit of what that resistance looked like and maybe draw some parallels. And I also want to touch on some quotes that'll give us a feel for what the people were thinking at the era, if you'll allow me to read some quotes I've cherry-picked from my book. So,
absolutely.
Okay, the resistance to the Australia Card. It was the largest public opposition campaign since those against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. So it was a large-scale protest that grew steadily over time. Now, here's one of the key takeaways that's still relevant today. The issue crossed all divisions in society. So it didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, where you lived in the country, what your ethnic background was, whether you're a white collar or a blue collar worker, whether you're young or whether you're old, what your skin color was. There was actually a term used at the time called strange bedfellows. This is what Bob Hawke referenced. It was an eclectic group of people that came together that united the nation against this. Now, the Australia Card wasn't defeated on its technical failings, and there were many that the Senate inquiry exposed. Its demise came through a visceral cultural objection to being branded and being punished for non-compliance. Now, let's go back to that Channel 7 clip you showed before. Do you notice the opening sentence was something like, the opposition said it would block the legislation after it was revealed that some of the that the legislation contained provisions for 5 years in jail and $20,000 in 1985 terms as well. This is significant. So when people started to see the punishments that they were facing, and again, we can apply that to today, going to what you just said, that's where some of the rallies started. I've actually got some information on what those punishments were actually. That I think it was Section 8 of the bill was entirely devoted to punishments. The word imprisonment appeared 28 times in that section of the bill, and penalty appeared 84 times. I manually counted them all. You couldn't even search in the scanned in PDF. So people objected to that. So what did that unification look like? Well, there were politicians, there were authors, there were journalists, there were business leaders, there were farmers, there were sports stars, doctors, barristers, musicians, academics, and religious leaders. So just an eclectic group all rallied together and spoke out. Even the famous yacht designer, Ben Lexon, who's renowned for designing the Australia 2 that had just fairly recently at the time won the America's Cup. He spoke out about it. So very prominent figures across the gamut of society spoke out about this. Now, let me read you a few quotes to demonstrate the kind of pushback that these prominent figures were putting into the public domain at the time. So I've broken these into categories, if you'll allow me. So this gives you a bit of a snapshot of the type of campaign that we need, I feel, now. So individuals, to start with. So there was a massive campaign that flooded radio and newspaper. Now, again, I think these are still good forms of media that we can pursue today. Radio is the type of thing, social media, you get the feed that you choose effectively. So that has limited effectiveness, especially if we're all banned from using it from the end of the year. But radio is the kind of thing people have in the background and just listen to. The so-called normies still listen to radio when you're driving in your car. Now, there was a Sydney talk show host at the time called John Tingle. So he claimed that for some weeks during that resistance campaign, it was impossible to get a caller that wanted to talk about anything other than the card. And we saw this during the cash ban campaign in recent years in this country. I remember Michael Zucker facing call-ins on radio, and there was one chap who called in and said, "Don't do this to our country." So radio call-ins are effective. Newspaper also, particularly the letters to the editor. So they're much less under editorial control. So if you get people writing in, that was very effectively used. And people still buy newspapers today. I see it today. So that's also an effective area to start to get the message out. So one such individual came from Tasmania. He was called Douglas Graham, and it's just one example of thousands of submissions. His quote to the Australian newspaper at the time was, "If the government sends me an identification card, I shall return it with a letter to explain that I do not need it. I already know who I am." So that's just a random individual. Religious leaders. So here's an example from Reverend Michael Challen, who was the Bishop of the Anglican Diocese of Perth at the time, and he was also chairman of the Social Responsibilities Commission. He actually appeared to the Senate hearing on this issue. He said, "At the moment, our society, by and large, operates on the basis of trust. Now and then, people are asked to identify themselves. It is the Commission's expectation that once a universal identity card system is established, that order will be reversed." So there's a religious leader making a fundamental statement about the nature of trust in our society. Politicians. So here are two Labor politicians, members of the party that were pushing this bill, who spoke out. One was an MP, Lewis Kent. He said, "Nothing can be more un-Australian than the need to prove one's identity on the call of an official, be it a policeman or a bureaucrat. I refuse to be numbered and branded." Now, that un-Australian term was used quite effectively during the campaign as well.
Very powerful.
Another one, MP John Saunderson, he said, "One can argue that the feeling one can develop with the card is that everybody is guilty. And the only way to prove your innocence is by the production of cards when you were doing your dealings." Again, the Indian experience, right? What about academics? Well, here's Geoffrey Walker, who was the professor of law and the head of department at UQ at the time. So his quote is, "The free and lawful person recognized by the common law attains legal personality simply by obtaining adulthood and is able to do anything which is not prescribed by law. The de facto effect of compulsorily requiring adult citizens to register with the state is to introduce an additional element which is essential for their legal personality." Another one, Professor Arthur Miller at the time said, "In the past, dictatorships have always come with hobnailed boots and tanks and machine guns, but a dictatorship of dossiers, a dictatorship of databanks, can be just as repressive, just as chilling, and just as debilitating." What about musicians? So many may know Peter Garrett. He's later in his political career, but originally at the time he was a musician. Peter Garrett came out and publicly called the Australia card, quote, "the greatest threat Australia has ever faced." And presumably that includes the bombing of Darwin by the Japanese.
And he became a Labor minister later on. Wow,
he became a Labor
I did
minister,
not know that. Yeah.
But my goodness, musicians, we covered musicians, legal representations. So here's Justice Michael Kirby. So he was president of the New South Wales Court of Appeal at the time, and he's a former chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission. So he said, get this one, again, all applicable to what we're facing today. What is at stake is not just catching a few tax avoiders. It's not even the efficiency of policing. It's not the defense of innocent and law-abiding citizens from lawbreakers. What is at stake is nothing less than the nature of our society, and the power of authority of the state in relation to the individual. And just to round out the quotes, I've got a medical representation as well. So we've had recent kind of tastes of what medical representatives do in recent years, some quite nobly, some quite disgustingly. But this is Dr. Bruce Shepherd, who was the AMA, the Australian Medical Association president at the time. So this is a quote from 1987. Given the, get this, and I think we should all digest this quite well. This is from the president of the AMA, Dr. Bruce Shepherd, said, given the horrific impact the card will have on Australia, its defeat would almost be worth fighting a civil war for.
Wow.
So those few quotes there, I know I labored and took a bit of time, but it just gives you a finger on the pulse of what quite a cross section of society was willing to come out and publicly say. And these are people in quite high standing positions in society as well. Well, we can go on a little bit to some lessons learned on solutions, but I'm happy to see if there are any comments on that before we do.
Yeah, look, I mean, wow. First of all, I mean, wow, how the mighty have fallen. The AMA then, like the Australian Medical Association, the Australian Medical Association now, right? I mean, take the vaccine, it's safe and effective, and we should mandate that. I mean, that just blew my mind. I mean, I did not know that. That just blew my mind. These are all good angles. I think one powerful angle that we can add in this particular aspect, because it wasn't applicable to the Australia card, which was a physical card, is the aspect of identity theft. And especially how serious and severe and basically impossible to remediate it will be if the if the My ID, like, digital ID or any digital ID scheme also includes biometric data. Right. So I've discussed that with Nicola Charles, and she's done a very good video about that, where she says basically you can't change, you can't take your eyeball out, right? So if there is a digital, or your fingerprint, you can't cut off your finger, right? So if there is a digital representation of your fingerprint or your retina scan stored somewhere, and someone takes that and is able to decrypt that, I mean, a digital copy can be replicated 1 billion times at zero cost. What do you do? How do you prove that it's not you, right? So this is something, all those quotes that I think he said are very, very good. I can't see any prominent, unfortunately, I can't see any prominent leader or someone with prominent standing in the community coming and saying, oh, this is worth fight a civil war over. I just can't see that happening. But people come, and people who have some authority on the aspect of security, cybersecurity technology, it's very hard to find people in that space who are not captured, right? Because they have kind of financial incentives to allow that to happen. But coming and saying, look, if you think identity theft is bad now, you've seen nothing yet. Because, okay, if someone and I've got a video, I'll include that again in the show notes, of identity theft, traditional identity theft, and what was the absolutely devastating implications just simply for someone whose wallet got stolen by a work colleague who assumed their identity, right? And it was bad. He ended up in jail, right? But I mean, think how much worse it will be if it's a digital representation of who literally they are, their retina scan and their fingerprint, and who knows then what happens with that, right? And all the banks work on that, right? If someone takes control over your digital ID, and there's only one digital ID, there's only one centralized database. That centralized database gets taken over, and that's it. It's the keys to the kingdom. So I think this is an aspect that is difficult for people to understand, and this is something that I think we can definitely use those previous arguments that you quoted, but I think if we add on top of that, and I think the responsibility is for people like us, who have a technology background and kind of have the ability to explain things in layman terms and not in geek speak, right? For people to understand what the actual implications are for this, and how much it's by orders of magnitude, it's actually worse than anything the Australia card could have ever achieved, or any national ID card in any country could have been, a physical one. Once it goes digital, it is 100 times worse.
Yeah.
So I think that's an angle that people need to understand, And they need to understand that they can potentially, like, they could lose their home. Someone could take over the title of their home because all the title deeds are like digitized now. I mean, they can apply for loans. They can take their bank account. They can, like, they can apply, like, they can literally take, like, if your login details at work, right, are connected to your digital ID because it's safe and the government looks after that. Someone can take over, like, your login accounts. If you work for the Australian Defence Force, or if you work for the Signal Directorate or for some spy agency, I mean, the implications are wild, right? So I've discussed that. I've discussed some of the national security implications as well. I've discussed that before in a previous post, and I'll include that. But I think, and this is really why I'm really happy to have someone like you on, because, I mean, we can explain things also from the technological perspective, the technological background, or the technological perspective, what it actually means for people, so they can understand, and they can understand what are the actual implications for them. Forget about CBDCs. I don't even want to talk about it. That's the next step, and it's very bad, but we need to stop it even before the discussion even moves to CBDCs. We need to stop it at the digital ID stage. So that's kind of, I guess, where I stand on that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you have any comments on that. Otherwise,
unsurprisingly, I do, Michael.
Yeah.
I think you're right, pushing the fear, because let's qualify that. We don't want to be fear mongers, but when there's a legitimate threat, and I make this case philosophically in my book, when there's a legitimate case as an active national service to warn our fellow countrymen of a lion around the corner, it's a moral obligation, and it's a legitimate fear of what, and I'll make a call, what will happen. Now, I say that with confidence because it's already happened before in India, and it's already happened before in Australia. So the MyGov ID, the MyID system has already experienced a number of leaks, hacks, abuses. There's extensive documentation from particularly one that I quote in my book, a professor who actually has a video of a replay attack on YouTube. You can go and look at it now. These things have and will continue to happen. So what does that mean? Well, early on when I was writing my book, I quickly learned that this actually isn't a technology story. It's quite a philosophical story. So identity theft is one that we need to push to the fore of people's minds. Now, you often hear victims of identity theft describe it as a kind of rape. It's quite a unique type of transgression against someone, because philosophically speaking, if someone's going around with all the identifying documents and characteristics that represent you, then who are you? If someone else is going around taking out loans in your name that you have to expend your heartbeats to earn money for and pay back, who are you? You've essentially lost sovereignty over the cause and effect linkage of your own behaviors. And there's an example of that too in the Australia case. So here's another avenue. One of the ways we can chip away at this is to put under the magnifying glass the agencies that will run it. So as I mentioned before, it was the Health Insurance Commission at the time who was gifted this godlike authority to run this program. Now, there was a prominent court case going on at the time that was constantly referred to in the media and public discussion. It was called the McGoldrick case. Now, the McGoldrick case involved the HIC divulging certain Medicare details of a doctor's patients to the police. Now, that was under the guise of prosecuting him for, at the time, alleged illegal abortions. Now, the police used that information that the HIC provided them from the Medicare records to approach two young girls as part of that investigation. Now, the way that they approached those girls, it was done in a manner that exposed their abortions to both their employers and their parents. So that was something that really struck home as a visceral violation, a breach of trust, a breach of identity. And it was a very effective case. Now, what made it worse is that the HIC actually claimed at the time that what they had done was within the provisions of their act. So that further drew into question putting trust in these government departments, even when they act within, the bounds of legitimacy. So that scared people even more about trusting officials. And later there was evidence in the court case that came out. Well, I'm not sure if it was in the court case, but evidence came out that the disclosure from the HIC predated any possible official authorization. So yeah, that was again, like it's effectively undeniable now that we will lose sovereignty over our identities, and the India case again shows that the fraud that they claimed that it would solve just relocated. You know, that often these monolithic identification systems don't solve fraud problems or solve identification problems or problems in society. They just shift them to other areas. So yeah, a couple of thoughts there. One final one on the Australia card before we move on is the government leaks. There was a trust, a group of people who came together that later formed in the Australian Privacy Foundation. It's still active today. That came out of the Australia card campaign. And there was a WikiLeaks type period during that resistance campaign where the APF would every Sunday of every week release some, ultimately fairly innocuous government leaks about how the operation of the Australia card will work in the rubber meets the road case. And what that did is it forced the minister responsible onto the back foot. So constantly in the media, he had to address these leaks, which were fairly trivial, but it kept it in the public focus, and it really got people thinking about how the scheme would work in reality. So yeah, and we can move on to some other lessons learned if you'd like to, or.
Yeah, so I guess the next thing I wanted to touch on, and I'm cognizant of time. So, I mean, if you still have the time, I do want to touch on the subject of, obviously you've covered the idea of self-sovereign identity and decentralized identity in your book. If you think that, this could be a potential alternative or potential solution or potential compromise or anything that is related to, I guess, our current predicament in Australia, but also in other countries where this agenda is obviously going to be pushed through, then I think it is worthwhile discussing that. So I guess it is up to you if you think that that's worth expanding on.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Look, and again, we're talking about, you just mentioned time there. I mentioned earlier in our chat, what is your sovereignty worth? What is your freedom worth? Certainly worth another half hour talking to you from my perspective. So let's do it. Just to wrap up on that solutions thing, and unfortunately we didn't get too far into it. For those interested, I've got a front page article coming out in the next edition of the Light Australia newspaper. So that's on exactly this topic. That's how I see the landscape at the moment, and I discuss 4 pillars of possible solutions that leverage the type of background discussion that we're talking about here. So you can have a look at that. It looks like this. That's the Light Australia. It's WA based. To the current issue you can download for free. It's issue 17. I've also got.
I'll link the PDF. On
page 4. Yep. If you're interested in background, obviously all that's free. There's stuff on my website. I make it as free as possible. So yeah, SSI. So when I started writing this book, I originally called it The Case Against Digital ID. And I talked to a colleague of mine, and he said, you might have some trouble selling that as an absolute position. And what he meant by that is we now live in an age where a lot of our lives is online. That's the one thing in Bill Shorten's video I actually agree with, right? We need a way to cleanly facilitate trust in the actual strict definition of the word online. And what that means, again, I devoted a whole chapter to that in my book, is the ability to become comfortable exchanging goods, services, or information with people we've never met before, or entities we've never met before, who are, remote from us and, pseudo-anonymous. We need that as a component of our economy. But, the Web 2 space, the kind of internet space that came around in the late 90s, as you referenced before, it was never designed to operate. It's kind of run out of runway. It was never designed to operate with the level of technology and the kind of commercial and economic activity we have now. So we need something. And I think our efforts here will fall flat on their face if we make an outright claim that digital identification is bad. So what do I mean by that? Digital ID is typically conflated with what we're talking about here, the specific case, centralized government-controlled digital ID. Now, it turns out that that's too long for a book title, but that's effectively what we're talking about here. So what are some alternatives? Well, it turns out in the process of researching my book that there's a whole area of mathematics and computer science that's already fairly well established with alternatives that remove the centralization component of identification. It turns out that identification is actually quite an obsolete tool as well. When we're asked to identify, has anyone actually asked themselves, why is that? You know, I don't identify myself to my neighbor for any other reason than just to call out names over the fence. You know, why is everything in society predicated on identification? We don't do it just for fun. It's because it's a proxy, it's a jumping step to obtaining that level of trust that I talked about earlier, that confidence in exchanging goods, services, or information. So the technology we have available today can either save or enslave us. So the flip side of that coin is it is, at least in the technical sense, not yet in the social sense, quite possible to almost eliminate identification entirely and still have that fairly smooth functioning, in fact, I would say even better functioning interactions online, because we can just jump now with technology to the trust stage without the stepping stone of identification. And it's the identification characteristics that are actually quite dangerous. They're the ones that lead to identity fraud and all the other things we've talked about. So, I mean, SSI, or self-sovereign identity, as it's called, is something that you could devote days talking about. So I'd like to throw a few pointers out there for people. I don't want to scare people off with too techie sounding stuff, but I want to here just give the impression that there are alternatives here that will allow us to flourish as a species and use technology to reduce friction in our interactions rather than introduce it. So let's start with one of the characteristics of self-sovereign identity. It's claimed to be, basically it makes the same claims as many of those videos you said before, but one of the big differences is when a government representative or a smiley face on a video says it's secure, as I mentioned before, you can immediately write that off, because that you have to trust someone else who you've never met about that security. What SSI does is it flips the ownership of that which identifies you. So whenever you have to sign up for an account or open a My ID account or a Google account or a Gmail account, the identifiers that go with that, they're created by the service provider. They're not created by you. So because of that inherent characteristic, you don't own them, so you can't control them. What SSI does is it allows you to generate your identifier. And there are various kind of technical ways that this is, well-established technical ways, by the way, that's done. So because the genesis of the identifier is done on your device, you know the sovereignty, you know the data provenance, the provenance back to its origin, which is something a centralized system that issues you a number can never claim. So in that regard, it is secure because it's physically in your hand. This is the kind of the air gap thing that you were talking about. But SSI is not just a technical framework, it's a social framework. So it removes a lot of the problems, the technical problems with centralized systems, but it also, and again, I go into much of the philosophical reasoning, and I even propose an entirely different way of structuring society based on trust and reputation rather than identification in my book. But it needs to operate in tandem with trust frameworks or governance models, or basically an agreement within society that we will behave in certain ways. So it can solve certain things, but it's not a panacea, you know. And the other 2 points I'll raise about SSI before maybe running through it a little bit more is you don't have to understand how it works to use it. In the same way you can just turn on your smart TV. No, I mean, who knows how a smart TV works? A very small percentage of the population, but you can still use it. And there are many companies already producing lovely products that actually have to vie in compete in the free market with competitor products for a smooth user experience that uses SSI technology under the hood, and you don't need to know how that works. And much of this too, it's not new technology. As I said, it's well established. It relies on public-private key encryption. If you've ever gone to a bank website, the little padlock in your browser, it's the same thing that you rely on now. A lot of the mathematics behind it comes out of the 70s. There's nothing new. It's very battle-tested stuff. So what SSI does is it better models how we treat identity in the real world. So in real life, we have many identities, right? So when you go to the airport, you're a traveler and your identification is typically in the form of a passport. You don't hand over a driver's license or anything else. There's a kind of standard exchange there. So you're a particular profile at the airport. But when you come home, you might be mum or dad. You know, that's how you identify. And an entirely separate set of behaviors and expectations apply. And I mean, this is what we call a contextual situation. Identity is very contextual. And in the real world, that results in a sense of safety. It feels safe that you can leave your passport at home, for example, because you don't need it in the context of what you're going to do today. But on the internet, the identification on the internet is not contextual. So we still have many kind of identities, but they bleed out into each other. So as I mentioned, for all your social media profiles, your phone number, your email account, even though we might choose what our email is, you know, maddog@hotmail.com or whatever, apologies if that's a legitimate address, I just made it up. Hotmail is actually issuing that to you, even though you can kind of choose sometimes what it calls. You know, if you don't pay your phone bill, your phone provider will just terminate your service, and then, you know, any two-factor auth or anything else that you use that as an identifying characteristic goes away because it wasn't created by you. So we don't have context on the internet, so we don't feel safe, and that bleeds into a lot of problems that are out of scope. But effectively, what SSI does is it applies a general engineering concept, and that's called the separation of concerns. So what that means is any entity in an architecture should do one thing. You know, it should have a well-established set of inputs and outputs. It does one thing and it does it well. And if there's a responsibility for some other spinning cog in the system, that's done by something else. But what's actually happening with the social media companies and with all the accounts that we have online is these entities are actually doing more than one thing. They're issuing identifiers, they're issuing credentials, they're verifying, they're doing lots of things. So what SSI does is break those down into separate components and allows us to be very granular with the information we share. And there's a bunch of kind of real world examples that I go into the book. But hopefully that wasn't too techie or beyond the scope of everyone's interest. But I make the case that SSI, along with a more reputation-focused change in our culture, has potentially remarkably positive prospects for our future. We don't need these monolithic systems.
100%. Look, I think as far as, like, you know, the nuts and bolts of SSI, I don't think we're going to get into that now unless you really want to, because it may go over people's head. But I guess my question is more of like something from a layman's perspective. Like, you know, why do we need that? Why can't we why do we need the digital ID in the first place? Like, why do we need it at all? Why can't we keep the system that we have now? We have logins with two-factor authentication, password stored in a password manager, and, like, you know, that's it. Like, why do we even need this new thing that, like, you know, people need to learn how to use? Like, you know, what's the benefit compared to what we have now?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's not really much learning to use, because these things will be issued to the public in very beautiful consumer-friendly ways, right? So there's not much of a hurdle there. But effectively, as I mentioned before, we need these sorts of things because we've reached the end of the runway with the way the internet currently works. The only way we've managed to kind of limp along is by adopting this non-contextual approach that leads to all the problems, the Optus data breaches, that's all these sorts of the problems that we're told that we need the government to centralize everything for, go away naturally when we look at these sorts of technologies without the cost and risk of these intermediaries, these centralized intermediaries. So, and it allows a more granular approach to how we reveal ourselves on the internet. So I'll give you a brief example. You know, a classic one is, you know, you have to show your driver's license at a pub or a bottle shop to prove you're over 18. Well, this is already fairly inefficient and leaks information in the real world. You know, you typically show your driver's license, which has all sorts of extra information about you that the person you're showing the verifier then gets to see. But that's even worse in the online case. There's all sorts of stuff that's leaked about us. What SSI allows you to do is prove to someone who's interested, a verifier, that you meet some criteria without revealing the underlying information that was used to determine that criteria. So in the bottle shop case, what is actually being displayed on the driver's license is someone's birthday. And from that, they derive the knowledge that you are over or under 18. So the birth date is a sensitive piece of information that has needed to be leaked to derive something else. That's totally removed with SSI. SSI can mathematically prove to a verifier, and again, it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but there are real world examples I can kind of go to if we need to kind of show how that works. That simply, it's the green tick that Bill Shorten talked about, except it's a green tick that relies on mathematics, not politicians. So it's much more attractive. It just says you meet the criteria of being over 18, not how old you are, not what your birthday is. Look at the educational space or the job space. At the moment, if you apply for a job, say, it might require a degree from something, you could potentially reveal your diploma or your degree to that employer. But again, you've leaked kind of when you went that course, what the issuing institution was. There's all sorts of other stuff there. If you apply for a job that requires a certain level of education in law, say, or whatever the job is, you can hand over that green tick. You can say, yes, I have a degree in law, without revealing what the institution was, when it was obtained. This is now by negotiation between the applicant, the job applicant, and the employer. So that may appear on an app where an employer may send a request to you to look at these certain granular characteristics. They may want to see what the issuing institution or university was and when it was, and you say, well, I'll tell you who gave me the degree, but not when I earned it. All of this is now at your fingertips. And that that's the case, again, because the information was birthed on your device. It's not being relayed by someone else. So there are many really exciting things that facilitate this. There's actually many sub-economies that come out of this that I touch on in the book. But yeah, we are just, go back to your question, we are just destined to see more of what's been happening. We're solving a problem with our global infrastructure by doing more of what created the problems in the first place. And we need to remove all of that friction and personal risk. And SSI, I make the case, is a potential solution to that.
Okay, these are actually really good examples. So I guess, I can translate, your examples to something that I guess we can relate to what we've discussed previously. So in the Australian context, obviously we have the under 16 social media ban, right, Bill? And the government is going to use that, to push their digital ID, like that My ID scheme, to prove that, you're over 16 in order to access social media. So one way potentially SSI can defend that, in a sense, is if we say, well, there's actually a competing system that is better, that is more privacy respecting, that doesn't actually, as you said, doesn't reveal the date of birth, but just tells the provider that is now legally obligated, starting from December, to make sure that you're over 16. It just gives them a yes/no answer. Is this person over 16? Yes or no? And that's all they need to know. They don't need to know your date of birth, right? So if people, and this is something that then you can say, okay, well, there's instead of having to go with My ID, the government scheme, there's 5 different ways that you can do that, and they can compete with each other, as far as security and how easy to use it is, and all of these will be acceptable, right? And if there are alternatives, I guess it also creates a bit of a problem for the government, because they can't come and say, oh, look, you can only use My ID, right, in order to prove that you're over 16 in order to access Facebook or Instagram or whatever, because then it's monopolistic behavior by the government. It's illegal, and there's commercial interests that are trying to compete with the government, and they will probably sue because they've invested money in creating and promoting their own system. So I like that angle. I think this is definitely something that's worth considering, especially in the Australian context, where like, the legislative stop, I guess, the train has already left that stop. So that the legislation is in place. The next step is enforcement. For the under 16 social media ban, that's going to be start to be enforced in December, right?
That's around the corner. Yeah. Just to piggyback on what you said there, there's one other benefit to this type of technology as well. You get complete visibility over who's requesting your credentials. So it actually flips the relationship that these centralized systems produce. In the centralized case, it's the government that knows everywhere that you've used your identification. It leads a digital trail. But with SSI, imagine you have a privately produced app, and it's like a cryptocurrency app potentially. You can pick whichever one you want. There might be free ones. It's completely open to you because it's an open playing field. Imagine you for argument's sake, you navigate this under 16 social media ban using SSI, hypothetically, and you get a pop-up saying, Twitter or X Corp is requesting ... approve or deny. And you go, okay, well, yep, I was just on there and that's me. But then something else pops up saying, whatever, Jim's mowing or whatever it is requesting ... And that has to come to your app because, again, the identifier was birthed under your control and it's never left your device. And you go, well, so you have complete visibility over who's requesting what, which is just not possible with current technology. So that's another level of comfort.
Nice. Okay, so I guess the last point I want to touch on it, and again, we're not going to get into the technical details. If people are interested in that, I'll include some resources in the show notes, and maybe we'll have a follow-up conversation. But I guess what thing I want to kind of clarify. So the government's My ID system is clearly ready to go. Like you can sign up now. Right? The competition, I guess, the SSI solution, like, if we were to present that as a potential alternative instead of using My ID, but there's actually nothing that people can sign up for now because everything is still in development, then we're kind of back at like, square one. So, if there is an argument to be made to the government, okay, government, you've already legislated that you want to prove that everyone is over 16, that's fine. But there are alternatives to using your proposed solution, which is My ID. Do we have something that people can sign up for now or will be ready to go by December in Australia?
So we have to be careful here of putting the cart before the horse. So I know there's a tendency to go, we just want to download the alternative app, right? And let's get going with that. That's not the case because, as I mentioned before, it needs to go hand in hand with the fundamental cultural change as well. An app alone or any sort of technological system won't change things. We first need to develop that same awareness, that same cultural pushback that I mentioned, in the Australia card. That comes first. Downstream from that is a private market recognition that there's a target market here, and then release the dogs of the private market, right? Because then there'll be profit to be made in that and providing the best solutions. And so no, it's not the case that something's ready to go now because the public hasn't voiced that this is an important issue yet to the extent that's required. So yes, I'm fairly confident something like that will come, but that I didn't get into some of the details, some of the other details there that possibly irrelevant, but the mass scale, this is important to us over my dead body type thing needs to snowball. And these things are not linear too. For those who are losing hope, and I know December's around the corner and no one really knows yet what's going to happen or what sort of cheat codes there are in that system. But these things can be exponential. And again, we saw that in the Australia card case. After the double dissolution election is when everyone lost their hair. So it can feel like all is lost until the 11th hour. And I potentially see that's where this is going to go, especially when we start to see some of the inevitable abuses that come from people who have an aggregation of power that's typical from these massive identification systems. Anyone interested in this sort of stuff, I've got information on my blog on my website, including a panel discussion that I was on with a private company that's building SSI-based not only architectures and products, but ecosystems that financially incentivize private business to adopt SSI. So back to your previous point about large institutions and banks will jump at the savings that can be had. Absolutely, that's actually been researched, and the CEO of this particular company goes into some of the detail of the research that he's done for his company on that. He confirms effectively what you said, Michael. He said the banks and others of a sufficient size will jump at this because they don't want to handle identifying information, but it has to be commercially viable. So there's a layer of economic incentives that are being built upon SSI technology that marry with the required social and cultural change. It's really a fundamental evolution of our society that we're talking about. Technology can only do certain things in alignment with where we want to go as a people, So yeah, it's a lot of spinning plates there, but I still have a lot of reason to be confident.
Okay, no, that's actually very, very valuable. Definitely send it to, and I'll include it in the show notes. But I guess one thing that maybe I'm kind of thinking, okay, what takeaway, like practical takeaway, we can leave people with, especially in Australia, especially in a very specific situation that we have here, which is legislation has already been passed. Our deadline for enforcement is, I think it's tentative, but it's probably going to start in December. The election has already happened. The government that pushed that through has been re-elected, right? So it's kind of very, very doom and gloom. But I guess my takeaway from what you just said, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm thinking is, okay, one viable thing that people can do right now, specifically in the case of the social media ban, like under 16-year-old, right? And the age assurance, age verification that will be required in some way or form, right? People can push back in the sense they're going to say, okay, that's fine. We're happy to do that, but my ID cannot be the only option. We want other options. So you cannot you cannot say, okay, my ID is the only option. Now, all of a sudden, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, that's 27 million people, right? That creates a massive demand, right? To a commercial entity, right? To put at least an MVP, like a minimum viable product, between now and December that at least can serve just this specific function of verifying, is this person over 16-year-old, yes or no? Like literally a 1 or 0 answer, okay? That is something that literally just the bare bones. Other functionality can be added on later, but if there's demand for that and people say, look, we want that, and there's significant pressure, from the opposition or from minor parties or whatever, saying, okay, well, look, fine, you legislated that, that's fine, but at least give people option. The government cannot have monopoly on that, right? That is a potential thing that in the context of the social media ban bill, which is legislated and going to be enforced between now and December, this is potentially a change that we can kind of have happen. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I love that. It's clear why you have adopted the term actionable truth. It's got to be actionable. So just to riff on that, a few points on that. There are a lot of spinning plates, and there's already in the public domain a bunch of proposals as best as they can be, given the fact that we don't know the implementation details yet, about potential ways around that. The go-to one is using a VPN and what effect that might have, for example. But I'm going to go a little bit of a different path here. I think a few important takeaways from here are very simple. And one of them is mental preparation. So we've got a fight ahead of us. We need to condition ourselves to the fact that the ease of use and access of the internet in Australia that we've come to know and love is to some extent coming to an end. It may blossom again in wonderful ways that exceed its usage today, but we need to prepare for difficulty. And if your cost, we talked about the $250 WA government payment, if your cost is not being able to scroll Instagram for a few months or whatever that looks like, then you kind of get what you pay for, I suppose. You need to come right with the idea that there's some difficult times ahead, that it will be inconvenient to stand up against these systems, the kind of resistance that self-sovereignty demands is potentially knocking at our door, right? And some mental preparation is very important. My upcoming article in the paper I mentioned in the Light Australia goes into this a little bit more. Also, we need to be aware that we don't have a fully fleshed out solution here. It's just not how these things work. We don't know how all these spinning plates will land. And I've got a good example of why that shouldn't stop us from trying. Back in the day when there was human slavery that was economically relied upon for agricultural harvesting, for example, and society got to a point where there was some recognition that slavery is morally wrong, but we can't really do anything. We can't take on emancipation because the economy would crash, right? Mm-hmm. So that doesn't matter. If you come up against a moral point, it's your obligation to act on that moral point, even though you don't have a fully fleshed out alternative. Now, it turns out that liberating human labor, particularly servitude from the cornfields, prompted the free market to ultimately produce these amazing machines that run on, liquefied dinosaur bones or whatever, that harvest the fields far more efficiently than humans could. But no one knew that at the time. When people were in chains harvesting fields, no one could have imagined that there would be tractors going around harvesting. But that only came around because we said we don't know what the solution is, but we know what's the path we're going down is wrong. And I would apply that same thinking to where we're at now. We don't necessarily know what technologies will liberate us from this, and we don't have to know. We just need to reject what's coming down the pipe and, as you said before, signal to private business, hey, there's a market here, and see what unfolds. So that's a bit of an unconventional take on what we could do. I think there's a bit of mental readiness that we need to do. We need to accept the fact that not having a fully fleshed out solution is perfectly normal, and we should proceed anyway with our resistance. And lastly, I think we can all play a small part or a major part in starting to nudge that, horse before the cart approach of the cultural change that all of this is predicated upon. And I make a case for this in my writing and articles as well. We need to make identification taboo. We need to ostracize those who demand it trivially. And that can be in every little interaction you have, from requesting, do you want an emailed receipt with that at Bunnings or whatever it is. And every little interaction, we need to make people feel embarrassed and awkward for asking any identification related questions. And that's the rubber meet the road thing, where these enforcement institutions, whether they be state-based or private, will just, it'll be a degree of self-policing placed upon, social self-policing that's imposed upon those who will ultimately be at the helm of enforcing this on the road. So it's time to start making people who are playing with fire here uncomfortable. Identification is off limits. In the same way you don't ask a lady if she's pregnant unless you're sure, or comment on a lady's weight gain, these sorts of things. There are taboo things in our society, and identification, particularly for bureaucratic reasons, needs to fall well within those goalposts. And we can start doing that today.
Here. No, I agree with that. And I think I would add to that, we need to signal that not just to businesses, but signal that to the government. Say, why do I need to do that? I haven't done anything wrong. Why do you need more information?
Who are you to ask? Who are you to ask? As I mentioned one of those quotes before, how it's un-Australian to ask, at the demand of a bureaucrat or a police officer. Because at the end of the day, all these people have their own homes and mortgages, and they have families. They're raising children who will live under these systems that pose such an existential threat. Make them uncomfortable. I would go as far as saying it's our moral obligation as a national service to start making people feel uncomfortable about this, because societies are defined by that which they will not tolerate. It's a Tucker Carlson line, and I just think it's so appropriate.
Yeah, look, I think, that's definitely something that I think the conversation in Australia need to switch, and people need to be a bit less passive, in the sense that, governments can get away with anything. So, I mean, it applies to health, it applies to, digital life, it applies to really any aspect. So I'm fully on board with you on that. I think this is a good place to end the conversation. But before we do that, I just want to see if people want to, have any questions or anything that they want us to discuss, given we're live, just before we wrap this up. So I'm just going to check now through all the, so that our live streaming page and Substack and Rumble, and see if people have any questions. So if you do have any questions that you want us discuss live, this is your chance to do so now. So I'm just going to give that a minute or two to see if people have any questions. And if not, that we are going to end that on this. Let me see. Okay. So nothing here and nothing here. All right. People are saying that this was a great presentation. So yep, I appreciate that. All right. This is last chance for action, for questions. Basically, ask now or forever hold your peace. So just don't want to keep all any longer. All right. So one final check. No, I think we're good. That's fine. I think we're good. So we're gonna end it on this note, Paul. I really, really appreciate you coming on. I'm going to send out the recording shortly after, like so once we're done here. And include in the show notes all the links that you mentioned, obviously to your book, to some of the conversations that you mentioned around SSI, to the article that you've already written in the Light Australia, so people can check that out, as well as your website. I'm just going to put that just so people can know where to find you. And yeah, I think we can end it on that note. I appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to chatting again.
Yeah, my pleasure, Michael, and really appreciate your time and your tenacity on this important topic. I can really see your passion, and it's great to share the fight with you. You know, there are moments in history where people of the lesser nobility, so to speak, are called upon to perform feats of the greater purpose, and I just feel like that relates to us all right now. And we've been so divided as a nation and as a people over the last years. And I think this
absolute nonsense, nonsense, unfortunately.
The silver lining of this, as we saw in the Australia Card case, is this is an opportunity for us to unite. This affects all of us. You know, let's actually rally around something positive and you know, gift the next generation something like what we inherited. So yeah, I've got all the time in the world for conversations like this. I really appreciate your time and putting it all together.
Thanks for coming on, Paul, and chat soon. Cheers.
Pleasure. Till then.